What happens when one of America's most beloved morning show hosts decides he's had enough of carefully crafted narratives and polite entertainment journalism? What happens when years of watching from the sidelines finally boil over into a moment of raw, unfiltered truth? Today, we're diving deep into a television moment that nobody saw coming. A clash that left viewers speechless and social media exploding with reactions. This is the story of how Michael Strahan completely dismantled Meghan Markle's carefully constructed image in front of millions of live viewers. And trust me, you need to see how this unfolds. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because this gets absolutely wild. Let's get into it. The Good Morning America studio was buzzing with its usual morning energy as Michael Strahan settled into his chair across from the Duchess of Sussex. The interview had been scheduled as a friendly promotional appearance, another stop on Meghan's media tour to discuss her latest charitable initiatives and upcoming projects. The producers had briefed everyone on the talking points, the soft questions, the comfortable territory that would make for good television without any controversy. But something was different about Michael that morning. Perhaps it was the mounting frustration he'd been feeling watching interview after interview, where difficult questions went unasked, where accountability seemed to be a foreign concept. Whatever it was, the moment Meghan settled into her chair, with that practiced smile, viewers could sense a tension that hadn't been scripted. "Meghan, welcome back to Good Morning America," Michael began, his voice carrying its usual warmth, but with an undertone that seasoned viewers might have noticed. "It's always interesting having you here because you have such a unique perspective on, well, so many things." Meghan's smile remained perfectly in place as she adjusted her posture. "Thank you, Michael. I'm always happy to be here and share what we're working on. There's so much positive change happening." "Positive change," Michael repeated slowly, leaning back in his chair. "That's fascinating because I've been thinking a lot about change lately, about how people present themselves versus who they actually are when the cameras aren't rolling." The comment hung in the air for a moment longer than comfortable, and viewers at home began to lean forward. This wasn't the typical softball opening they were expecting. Meghan's media training kicked in immediately. "Well, I think authenticity is something I've always strived for, Michael. What you see is really what you get with me." Michael's eyebrow raised slightly, and there was something in his expression that suggested he was about to challenge that assertion in a way nobody expected. "Authenticity," he said, the word rolling off his tongue with what could only be described as skeptical amusement. "That's a word that gets thrown around a lot these days. Let me ask you something, and I hope you don't mind me being direct here." "Of course not," Meghan replied, though her grip on her coffee cup had tightened noticeably. "When you left the royal family, you cited media intrusion and lack of support as major factors. You painted a picture of an institution that was, frankly, almost cruel in its treatment of you. But here's what I find interesting. You've done more media appearances in the past 3 years than most A-list celebrities do in a decade. So help me understand this contradiction." The question hit like a thunderbolt. This wasn't in the pre-interview notes. This wasn't the gentle, supportive questioning that had been promised. Meghan's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before she recovered. "I think there's a difference between choosing your platform and having your narrative controlled by others, Michael." "Is there, though?" Michael pressed, and now his voice had taken on the edge that made him such a formidable presence. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been controlling your narrative pretty effectively. You've had Oprah, you've had Netflix, you've had podcast deals, book deals, speaking engagements. You've told your story on every major platform available. So when you say the media was intrusive, what you really mean is they weren't telling the story you wanted them to tell, right?" The studio had gone completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath. This was live television at its most unpredictable, and everyone knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Meghan straightened in her chair, her media training warring with what was clearly rising irritation. "Michael, I think you're oversimplifying a very complex situation. When I speak about media intrusion, I'm talking about the lack of privacy, the constant speculation, the way stories were twisted." "Twisted how?" Michael shot back without missing a beat. "Give me a specific example, because I've been in this business for a long time, and have seen how stories get covered. What exactly was twisted about your coverage that wasn't true?" The question was direct, demanding, and completely unlike anything Meghan had faced in her recent media appearances. She was clearly unprepared for this level of pushback, especially from someone she'd likely assumed would be another friendly face. Well, there were many instances where context was removed, where private moments were made public. Private moments like what? Michael interrupted. Because everything I've seen reported about you and Harry has either come from your own interviews, your own social media posts, or official palace communications. What private moments are you referring to? Meghan paused, and in that pause, millions of viewers could sense she was scrambling. I think what people don't understand is the emotional toll of having every aspect of your life scrutinized. Michael leaned forward, and his next words would become the moment that defined this entire encounter. But Meghan, and forgive me for being blunt here, isn't that exactly what you signed up for when you married into the most famous family in the world? And more importantly, isn't that exactly what you're continuing to do every time you sit for another interview? Every time you release another statement? Every time you make another appearance? You can't claim you want privacy while simultaneously living your most personal moments in public. The silence that followed Michael's pointed question was deafening. Viewers across America could practically feel the temperature drop in that studio as Meghan processed what had just happened. This wasn't going according to any script she'd prepared for, and her carefully constructed media persona was beginning to crack under the pressure of real journalism. I think you're being unfair, Michael, she finally responded, her voice carrying a slight tremor that hadn't been there moments before. There's a difference between sharing your truth and having lies spread about you. Michael wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed energized by her defensive response. Okay, let's talk about truth then. You've made some pretty serious allegations. Over the years, you've talked about racism within the royal family. You've discussed your mental health struggles. You've painted yourself as someone who was essentially abandoned by an institution. But here's what I'm curious about. Where's the accountability on your side? Accountability for what exactly? Meghan shot back, and now viewers could see the polished facade beginning to slip entirely. For the staff turnover. For starters, Michael replied without hesitation. 17 staff members left their positions during your time as a working royal. 17? That's not normal turnover, Meghan. That's a pattern. Yet in all your interviews, all your tele-sessions, you've never once acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, you played a role in creating a difficult working environment. Meghan's eyes flashed with anger. Those are allegations that were never proven, Michael. You're repeating tabloid gossip. Am I, though? Michael leaned back, clearly prepared for this response, because the palace investigated bullying complaints. They may not have published the results, but they investigated. And interestingly enough, right around the time those investigations were wrapping up, you and Harry announced your departure. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? That's completely unfair, and you know it, Meghan replied, her voice rising slightly. We left because we weren't being supported, because there was a toxic environment that we couldn't continue to expose our family to. Michael's expression hardened. Toxic environment. Let's talk about that for a minute. You had access to the best security in the world, unlimited resources, a global platform to champion causes you cared about, and the support of millions of people around the world. But you found that toxic. It's not about the material things. Michael, no, you're right. It's not about material things, Michael interrupted. It's about respect, it's about gratitude, it's about understanding the position you were given and honoring it. But instead, you've spent the last 3 years systematically dismantling the reputation of an institution that welcomed you, changed centuries-old traditions to accommodate you, that literally changed the law to make your children princes and princesses. Meghan's composure was hanging by a thread. They welcomed me. Is that what you call it when they refused to protect me from racist attacks in the press? Show me one racist attack that the palace didn't address. Michael fired back immediately. Show me one instance where they didn't issue statements, where they didn't take action when warranted. Because what I see in the record is an institution that consistently defended you, that consistently supported you, until you decided that support wasn't enough. The tension in the studio was now palpable. Crew members were exchanging glances, unsure whether they should intervene or let this extraordinary moment continue to unfold. You don't understand what it was like, Meghan said, her voice now carrying a note of desperation. You don't understand the pressure, the isolation. The isolation. Michael's voice rose with incredulity. Meghan, you had Oprah Winfrey's personal phone number. You had access to Hollywood's elite before you even met Harry. You had a successful acting career, your own social media following, your own brand. Where exactly was the isolation? It's not about having famous friends, Michael. It's about feeling supported by the institution you're representing. But that's just it, Michael pressed on relentlessly. You weren't just representing the institution, you were part of it. And being part of something means sometimes putting the greater good ahead of your personal feelings. It means understanding that your role is bigger than your individual desires. But you've never seemed to grasp that concept. Meghan straightened in her chair, clearly trying to regain control of the narrative. I think what people don't understand is that I tried to make it work. I really did. But when you're not being heard, when your concerns are being dismissed, when you're being blamed for things that aren't your fault, you have to make difficult decisions. Michael shook his head slowly. See? This is exactly what I'm talking about. Even now, in this moment, everything is about what was done to you. Everything is about how you were treated, how you were misunderstood, how you were failed by others. Where's the moment where you say, maybe I could have handled things differently? Where's the moment where you acknowledge that walking away from royal duties while keeping the titles and the benefits might have been seen as having your cake and eating it too? We gave up our royal duties, Meghan protested. Did you though? Michael's question was sharp and direct. Because you're still using your Duchess title, you're still trading on your royal connection. You're still leveraging that relationship for commercial gain. You left the work, but kept the brand. How is that giving up anything? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Meghan's response would reveal just how deep Michael was willing to push this confrontation. Her hands were visibly shaking. And her carefully applied media training was completely failing her in the face of this sustained assault on her public narrative. I think you're being deliberately obtuse, Michael, she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. We stepped back because we wanted to build something meaningful, something that would make a difference in the world. By making deals with Netflix and Spotify worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Michael shot back by starting a lifestyle brand, by doing paid speaking engagements where you rehash the same grievances over and over again. That's your idea of meaningful change. The studio was completely silent now, except for the hum of the cameras and the barely audible sound of Meghan's increasingly labored breathing. This had gone far beyond a typical morning show interview and had become something resembling a cross-examination. Michael wasn't finished. The seasoned broadcaster could sense that this was the moment to drive his point home. To ask the questions that every other interviewer had been too polite or too intimidated to ask, he leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone that somehow made his next words even more devastating. Meghan, let me ask you something that I think a lot of people are wondering about, he said, his tone deceptively calm. You've talked extensively about your mental health struggles during your time in the royal family. You've described feeling suicidal, feeling abandoned, feeling like you had nowhere to turn. And I want to be clear, mental health is serious, and if you were struggling, that's genuinely concerning. Meghan nodded slightly, perhaps thinking this was Michael pivoting to a more sympathetic line of questioning. But here's what I find troubling, Michael continued, and his voice hardened again. You say you felt suicidal and had no one to turn to, but you also had the resources to hire the best publicists in Hollywood, the best lawyers, the best media strategists. You had the ability to coordinate a multi-million-dollar exit strategy from royal duties. You had the presence of mind to secretly record conversations and keep detailed records for future use. Does that sound like someone who was helpless and had nowhere to turn? The color drained from Meghan's face. This was territory no interviewer had dared venture into before. That's a completely inappropriate question, Michael, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it though? Michael pressed on. Because you've made your mental health struggles a central part of your public narrative, you've used them to explain and justify your actions. So I think it's fair to ask whether those struggles were as severe as you've portrayed, or whether they were convenient explanations for decisions you'd already made. Meghan was visibly struggling now, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. You have no right to question someone's mental health struggles. I'm not questioning your mental health, Michael replied firmly. I'm questioning your honesty about your mental health. There's a difference. And frankly, using mental health as a shield against legitimate criticism does a disservice to people who are genuinely struggling. The studio was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. Even the camera operators seemed frozen in place, unsure whether they should continue filming or intervene. "You know what, Michael?" Meghan said, her voice now shaking with fury. "I came here thinking I was going to have a respectful conversation about the work I'm doing, about the positive changes I'm trying to make in the world. Instead, you've ambushed me with tabloid talking points and conspiracy theories." Michael's response was swift and brutal. "Tabloid talking points? Meghan, everything I've asked you about has come from your own interviews, your own statements, your own public record. If asking you to account for your own words and actions feels like an ambush, maybe the problem isn't with the questions." "I think we're done here," Meghan said, starting to remove her microphone. "Are we?" Michael asked, his voice stopping her in her tracks. "Because this is exactly what you do, isn't it? The moment someone asks you a difficult question, the moment someone challenges your narrative, you walk away. You did it with the royal family, you did it with your father, you did it with your half-sister, and now you're trying to do it here." Meghan froze, her hand still on her microphone. "Excuse me, you heard me," Michael said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority as a broadcaster. "You have a pattern, Meghan. When relationships become challenging, when people don't give you exactly what you want, when you're held accountable for your actions, you cut them off. You burn bridges, you walk away, and then you tell the world that everyone else was the problem." "That's not true," Meghan protested, but her voice was weak. "Isn't it?" Michael countered. "Your father, who walked you down the aisle at your wedding, who you claim was loving and supportive for most of your life, became persona non grata the moment he made a mistake. Your half-sister, who you grew up with, who you had a relationship with for decades, suddenly became a stranger you barely knew when it was convenient for your narrative. Staff members who worked for you became liabilities to be discarded. And, ultimately, an entire family, an entire institution that embraced you, became the villain in your story when they couldn't give you everything you wanted on your terms." Meghan was silent now, her face a mask of barely controlled rage and humiliation. Michael leaned back in his chair, his voice taking on an almost paternal tone. "Here's the thing, Meghan. I think deep down you know that your version of events doesn't hold up to scrutiny. I think you know that you've built your post-royal career on grievances that don't quite add up, on victim narratives that don't quite ring true, and I think that's why you've been so careful to only do interviews with people who won't challenge you, who won't ask the hard questions." "You don't know anything about me," Meghan whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know enough," Michael replied firmly. "I know that you had opportunities most people can only dream of, and you threw them away because they came with responsibilities you didn't want to accept. I know that you've made millions of dollars by essentially burning down relationships and institutions that tried to support you. And I know that at some point, someone needed to look you in the eye and tell you that your behavior has consequences." The final moments of this extraordinary encounter played out in almost complete silence. Meghan sat frozen in her chair, clearly struggling to process what had just happened. Michael maintained his professional composure, but viewers could see the satisfaction in his eyes at having finally asked the questions that needed to be asked. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael said, turning to face the camera directly, "that's what real journalism looks like. That's what happens when someone is finally held accountable for their public statements and actions." As the cameras continued to roll, Meghan finally stood up, removed her microphone completely, and walked off the set without another word. The studio erupted in chaos as producers and staff tried to figure out what to do next, but Michael remained calm and professional throughout. This interview would become legendary in television history, not just for its confrontational nature, but for the way it demonstrated what happens when carefully constructed public personas meet real journalistic scrutiny. It was a masterclass in holding public figures accountable, and it left viewers across the country talking about it for weeks to come. What did you think of this incredible showdown? Did Michael go too far, or was this exactly the kind of accountability we need more of in celebrity interviews? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe for more content like this, because we're just getting started with these deep dives into the moments that define our culture.